All right, what do you think, Dr. Goodrich? You ready to go?
Sure, I'm
All
ready.
right. All right. So, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for today's My Cares webinar. I'm Justin Colsino, and I'm an associate professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And I'm an investigator on the My Cares project, and I'll be your host today. And it is my very distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jackie Goodrich. And so, Dr. Goodrich is a research associate professor of environmental health sciences here at U of M School of Public Health. And her lab investigates how chemicals like PFAS and heavy metals alter DNA and increase disease risk, particularly in women and children and firefighters, like she'll be telling us about today. And she's had a really impactful research career. Her discoveries of advanced strategies to better protect vulnerable populations. And so we'll have Dr. Goodrich present for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, please go ahead and add them in the Q&A section. And then at the end, I'll help moderate that discussion. With that, I am happy to turn it over to Dr. Goodrich. Dr. Goodrich, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for that kind introduction and for inviting me to speak today. Thanks to all of our attendees for being here. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the things that I've learned about firefighter risks for cancer and how we can prevent that in the last almost 10 years that I've been working with firefighters. So I know in my cares is kind of focused on anything in the environment that can cause cancer. And I'm concerned about occupational health because, people spend at least 40 hours a week, many, many, many years at their jobs. And if there's anything in the workplace that causes cancer, that's something we definitely need to get a handle on. And with that in mind, when we think about firefighters, that it is kind of a unique job, but there's actually quite a lot of them in the US. There's over 1 million firefighters in the United States. Some of them are career and paid, some of them are volunteers, and they do it outside of another job. But all of them have increased risk for cancers and some other diseases because of their job. But it's a very important job. So our solution can't be just to not have firefighters. We need to understand these risks and find other ways to prevent them while still having this important job in our society. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about firefighter health overall, and then what we know about their cancer risks and some of the research that I've been working on to identify what some of these harmful exposures are, and also what some of the mechanisms are that are leading from an exposure to causing disease, and just tell you a tiny bit about some things that we're trying to do to protect firefighters and their health. So firefighting, again, is a very unique job. As you can imagine, there's lots of different exposures that firefighters have. It's not just one major one. They can be exposed to heat, massive amounts of stress, things like flame retardant chemicals that are used either in their gear, but that they also encounter when buildings and vehicles are burning. Any chemical that ends up in smoke, things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are essentially products of combustion when many different things burn, PFAS, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and then also really specific chemicals or hazards that can occur, say, at a factory fire or something unique that's burning that releases a unique exposure. And on top of all that, they even have sleep disruption and some of the challenges you might see with shift work. So there's really a lot of different hazardous things that firefighters can encounter. And because of, in many ways, the culmination of all of these exposures, we know that on the job, of course, firefighters can be at risk for injury, but, best practices and safety practices help to prevent that whenever possible. But because of all those other exposures, we've seen that there are some reproductive outcomes, problems with fertility and things like that, that firefighters sometimes experience, higher risk for things like heart attacks, lung function problems, even whole body effects, things like systematic inflammation, things like mental health, like higher risk for PTSD based on, situations that are encountered in the job. But in addition to all of that, this is a webinar that's more focused on cancer. So we do know that firefighters are also at increased risk for multiple cancers. And I was involved in a working group that the World Health Organization puts on through an agency called IARC, where we use a very systematic way to look at all the data that's out there, in this case on firefighter health, and evaluate, does this evidence say that working as a firefighter could cause cancer or not. And a couple of years ago, when we evaluated this risk using all the data we had on firefighters from around the world, the conclusion was that firefighting does cause cancer. So it got the highest rating, what we call a group 1 rating. And this evidence came from a lot of different streams. It came from looking at the things they're exposed to, from studies that showed certain rates of cancers in firefighters, and also looking at mechanisms that happen in the body that could lead to these cancers. So some of the interesting data was that even though this rating means that it has a chance to cause cancer overall, and that could be any type of cancer, there was the strongest specific evidence for mesothelioma and bladder cancer. There was also some evidence for colon cancer, prostate, testicular melanoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And in addition, there was some evidence, but it was a bit conflicting. Sometimes in one study you saw it, in another study you didn't. Or in some cases, there just really wasn't enough research, so we weren't sure. But there's some evidence out there as well for higher risks for breast and ovarian cancer, lung cancer, thyroid, possibly brain cancers, and more, though we're still learning more about those as we go. So with all that in mind, what's important for us to know on the prevention side is how is this happening and why? And to get at that, we need to understand what are the exposures. We know, in that first slide I showed you, there's a bunch of exposures that firefighters have, but not all of them might be the ones that really get into their body, stay in their body, and could eventually lead to disease. So we want to think about and figure out what some of those more harmful exposures are so that we can find ways to have better protective equipment to protect against that. So we need to learn a little bit more about what the specific and perhaps worst exposures are, and also how is this happening in the body. And when we do these evaluations with IARC, we look at 10 different mechanisms that are ways that we know carcinogens can change a healthy cell into eventually being a cancer cell and a tumor and things like that. And among firefighters, there was strong evidence that 5 of the 10 can happen from things they're exposed to. And they're listed here. I'm going to talk about epigenetic alterations a bit and explain that to you. But there's also evidence that things like oxidative stress, inflammation, modulation of receptors, which are things like that hormones bind to and work through, for instance, and also genotoxicity, which is DNA damage and mutations that happen from firefighting exposures. So these are things that can happen in the body, but if there are ways to reverse these things, then we might be able to protect firefighters and reduce their risk for cancers. So with all that in mind, I'm just going to give you a couple really quick examples of how we're trying to look at these mechanisms and these exposures and use that knowledge to protect firefighter health. So I work with something called the Firefighter Cancer Cohort Study. Our goal is to enroll 10,000 firefighters and follow them for their whole careers if we can. And in addition to a bunch of survey data, we also collect urine and blood samples so that we can measure some of these exposures and these mechanisms when firefighters are still healthy before they develop disease. As of approximately right now, we have over 8,000 firefighters enrolled from 32 states. Sometimes we enroll brand new firefighters so we can see them before they have any exposures and what happens after. We also have an enriched recruitment for women firefighters because there's not as many of them, but we want to be able to have enough evidence to look at women-specific cancers and things like that too. And we also enroll a lot of wildland firefighters who work in the Western United States who have been working on these, huge and frequent wildfires out there these last few years. So what do we do? At the basic level, we partner with certain fire departments, and we go to their stations or other central locations. Firefighters come in when they're free. They provide blood and urine samples, fill out a questionnaire that gives us a lot of information about their health, their occupational, and their kind of lifestyle practices too. And then we store those blood and urine samples and use them for different analyses down the line. And we've measured things like PFAS, and we've measured epigenetic markers, which are some of those mechanisms of toxicity using these samples. And this is the general paradigm that we work through with the ultimate goal of protecting health, protecting against cancer through, complete prevention, reducing some of the exposures, or even on the other end of the line, things like early detection of people who are at high risk. And so along this paradigm, the first thing we do is look at some of the exposures that firefighters have. We know there's a lot of stuff in the air, but we also want to know what's actually getting into and impacting the body. So we've looked at products of combustion. We've looked at PFAS. We even have looked at stress in firefighters and among other things. I won't be able to talk about it all today. And some of the ways we assess the impacts of exposure, sometimes we enroll new firefighters when they're in their very early training class, and then we follow them up again 2 to 3 years later, and we're able to see, do they have exposures that weren't in their body when they enrolled, but now they are after they've been working for a while. Or sometimes we just look at health impacts they've had after 2 or 3 years, and we can consider those to be from those cumulative exposures, all of those things that are happening in a firefighter job. So we have quite a few sub-studies that use this design. We've also focused on very specific exposures. You might have probably talked about PFAS and maybe some of these MyCares webinars before, but per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which I'll just say PFAS from now on, are chemicals that a lot of people are exposed to, but firefighters have some unique sources. The picture there, firefighters are actually using a PFAS-containing foam to put out a fire. In this case, it's a training fire, which is why it's not really big. But this foam, you can imagine when they're done, it just, might rain or something, and then it just looks like it washes away, but PFAS don't really break down. So even if you don't see them, all of the PFAS in that foam is now in the environment. Sometimes it gets on the firefighters if they don't wear their gear through the whole exercise and things like that. Some of it might end up getting on their equipment and in the station, depending on where this was used. So this is one source of exposure. Luckily, most states aren't really using the PFAS containing foams anymore, but for many years, firefighters had a lot of exposure to this foam. There's actually PFAS in certain parts of their gear. And then there's a lot of PFAS in products in homes. So when a home burns, some of that volatilizes and firefighters can be exposed to that, along with other sources that anyone in the US could have, such as contaminated drinking water. And because there's been PFAS in all these different firefighter products, sometimes you can even measure it in the dust in a fire station. So we know it's around, and we know it was an exposure of concern and an exposure that is also linked to cancer. Because of that, we've measured PFAS in quite a lot of firefighters and done some research with that. Lately, we've also been working on more unique incidents and wildfires. So you've probably heard that wildland fires are increasing in the Western US and even in other parts of the world in frequency and in size and duration. These fires can be very complex and very hard to put out. A wildland fire can burn for weeks and weeks. And you can see the picture in the bottom corner, the firefighters in yellow there are not wearing the gear we typically think about. They're really not very protected. But you can't wear that big heavy gear and a respirator and all those things, or an SCBA, when you are, having to hike up a mountain to get to a fire, or when you're going to be there for 12 hours a day for 2 weeks in a row. You just can't wear that type of heavy and hot gear. So wildland firefighters often have a lot of inhalation exposures because they just don't wear the same gear. And then also the picture at the top shows a wildland urban interface fire, where a big wildland fire meets a community. And we've seen a lot of these lately, and they're devastating to communities, and they're also really challenging for firefighters to put out. Now you have very complex fuel sources that they're exposed to. So we're interested in finding better ways to protect firefighters from incidents like these, and understanding too what some of those exposures are. Along the same lines, I've also worked with what we call high-risk incidents, things that you might only expect to happen once in a lifetime, like the East Palestine train fire, when a train containing a carcinogenic chemical caught on fire, and volunteer firefighters in the region had to go and put that out, and were exposed for 2 days straight to this this heavy carcinogen. There was also very large and devastating wildfires in Maui, and then in 2023, and in the Los Angeles area in 2025, that firefighters had to work on these incidents for weeks at a time and had very high exposures. So we're interested in seeing, did that contribute to their health risks in a major way, and what can we do about that? That's the exposure side of things. Just quickly on the mechanism side of things, we try to see how these exposures are impacting their body, especially because we want to understand, is there a way we could possibly prevent that? And as we know from IARC, there's a lot of mechanisms at play, but my group in particular studies epigenetics. And if you haven't heard of epigenetics before, I like to use a music metaphor to describe it. You can think of genetics, the genetic code that's in all of your cells, as being like a piano. Every piano has the same keys which play the same notes. And like that, in your body, each your genetic code is the same in every cell. But the epigenome is how that can be expressed and used. So much like a musician can sit at a piano and play thousands of different songs, in each of your cells in your body, that set of genes can be turned on and off in different ways, and that'll lead to different functions. For instance, something in your liver, a cell in your liver operating differently than one in your brain, but also a healthy cell operating a lot differently than a cancer cell. And epigenetics is important because we know that a bunch of exposures impact the epigenome, including ones that firefighters have. And why this is important is because if you make a change to an epigenetic mark, and this cartoon is representing DNA methylation, which is one of them, then that could last for a long time. When that cell divides, it passes on the change to the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And if it disrupts a gene that you need, well, that could down the line lead to disease. And we've done a lot of work with these markers in firefighters. Some of the highlights I wanted to share with you today are that we see some of these epigenetic markers change in new firefighters after they worked for 2 years. So that culmination of a lot of the exposures they have can impact the epigenome. We've seen it change in relation to very specific exposures, in firefighters who have higher PFAS levels, in firefighters who went to one of those wildland urban interface fires, and even to firefighters who went to a one-time high-risk incident like the East Palestine train fire. And these changes are in genes that have a lot of different functions, but some of them are genes that we know are involved in the process that makes a healthy cell eventually become essentially cancer. But we don't know if these changes are adaptive or if they're transient. This doesn't mean that all of these firefighters will get cancer, but this is one possible mechanism that could contribute to that happening down the line. It could be part of the tipping point that leads to cancer. And because of that, we really want to intervene if we can. So a lot of this is quite new, but the team, especially my colleagues at University of Arizona, are working a lot on interventions. We know some now about exposures. We know a little bit now about the mechanisms. What can we do? We're testing some things that aren't rocket science necessarily, but things like exercise and nutritional interventions that have beneficial health impacts that might kind of offset some of the negative health impacts of the exposures. We're also trying out things like blood and plasma donation, which can actually remove PFAS from the body and just reduce that burden of exposure. And we're also trying nutritional interventions like broccoli seed and sprout extract that, again, has antioxidant properties and could potentially combat against the impacts of exposures. And then we have other colleagues that are testing better protective equipment too, to prevent those exposures from getting into the body in the first place. And before I go to the Q&A section, I'd just like to say thanks to our funders. This study, it's one big study, but really it's all these little studies that has been funded mostly by FEMA and NIH over the years, and a couple of state funding streams as well. And there's a huge team that works on this, and there's more than who are listed here. And I'm really grateful to the whole team that makes this run, including our fire service partners who help us spread our message and also help us to recruit firefighters into the study. And with that, we can go into the question and answer time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Goodrich. That is outstanding presentation, really impactful work. Just as a reminder for folks, if you want to add some questions into the Q&A, we can communicate those to Dr. Goodrich. But we do have some questions to lead this off. And so, Dr. Goodrich, you talked a little bit about this, and you're thinking about sort of like interventions. But if you know someone who's a firefighter, what are some steps that they can take daily to decrease their risk?
Yeah, and unfortunately, we know some that are pretty basic.
Yeah.
And these are messages that we try to spread to a lot of departments too. And some of them have these as best practices already, but there's things that there's something called shower within the hour. If you go to a fire response, clean off, there's a certain decontamination procedure that you can use to wash off your gear. And then also it's recommended if you don't have to go right out to another call to shower, because sometimes there's stuff in your skin that got through, even through your gear. We often see that. So those are practices that really help a lot. And that's pretty basic, actually. So those two practices, like basically decontaminating your gear and showering after responses when you can, are really helpful. And then we always encourage just good, like when you can, healthy diet. And on your off days, you can't really control it when you're on shift, but on your off days, try to get good sleep if you can, things like that too, because those are other beneficial practices overall.
That's great. Thanks so much. And we have a question in the chat from Mark, who asked, can firefighters volunteer to the study?
They can. The way we kind of do recruitment and enrollment, we work with certain departments, although there's a lot of them. We're working with 400 right now. And so we only do recruitment and enrollment events there. I could probably see if we're already connected with your department, because if someone is interested, they could email me and I could see if we're connected to your department already, because that would be a way to enroll. But there's also a nationwide study that's online only. They don't do in-person recruitment, called the National Firefighter Cancer Registry. And that one, I would encourage all firefighters to enroll in. It's just an online survey. And then they kind of use your health records to track firefighter cancer risks over time too. So if you're not in that one, I would highly encourage that one as well. And anyone could be in that study.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. One other question that just came in the past, doctors used to recommend additional vitamin C intake for cigarette smokers. Have you considered vitamin C supplementation as a specific intervention?
That's a good question. We haven't worked on that specifically, but some interventions that we have considered were like an antioxidant diet type intervention where vitamin C is one of the components of that.
And then let's see here's another interesting question. So in regard to your study, what are the steps you take to communicate results with firefighters, specifically around early detection? And then do you have physicians that are working on the study with you that can help with care for your firefighter participants?
Yes, those are great questions. Within our study, we don't really do like screening, but we have some partners that do. So a lot of our departments also work with these specific clinics and things like that do cancer screens regularly every year, every other year for all of their firefighters and things like that. So we encourage that, even though we don't do that in our study. And the main PI of the whole cohort, Jeff Burgess at University of Arizona, is an MD, and he has worked in occupational medicine. So he's someone too that will talk to our firefighters as needed, but if someone has a particular issue, we often try to reference them to an OCMED person in their region.
Nice. And then another question just came in. I want to know, in this cohort study, will you consider race or genetic makeup, which can affect cancer incidence?
Yeah, that's a great point too. Obviously, each person already has a baseline risk based on their genetics, family history, and things like that. And we aren't actually looking at genetics in our study. It was just part of kind of what we agreed to do at the beginning and what our participants are consented to do or not do. But we do consider in a lot of our analyses, we adjust for things like race and ethnicity and age and other factors that could also increase their risks. And sometimes we look at subgroups separately, if there's enough people in them too, because yes, we agree there's certain groups that are going to be at higher risk for certain cancers, just from the get-go.
Yeah. Yeah. So a question that I also am curious about, is there any study on the impact of sauna use for detox?
Oh yes, we haven't worked on sauna use, but it's a bit popular right now in the fire service. There's some researchers who are working on it, and there's also some departments that are just kind of have access to a sauna and are trying it out. So I think the evidence is still mixed, but there's still work in progress. We have seen there's some evidence that, the idea is that people might sweat out certain kinds of chemicals when they go into these saunas after a fire. And things like metals, there's some evidence that works so far, heavy metals, but I think there's still more to come on that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then another question about the participants in your study. Will firefighters be followed up if they're found to be at increased risk of cancer?
Yeah. What So right now, the markers that we're measuring don't actually, they kind of show you've had these changes in your body happen that might lead to cancer down the line. But the markers that we're using right now aren't like truly diagnostic or anything like that. So if down the line we ever started measuring things like that, where we had more certainty, like, okay, this person is really at a high risk. I think we do have protocols in place where we could communicate that information. Like as of right now, we do have share certain results. A lot of times it's just this is what the study's seeing so far, but sometimes it's individual results. Like when we measure chemical exposures, we share that result with each person, like their own result. So yeah, down the line, if we're measuring using a very, very like diagnostic or predictive biomarkers, we would definitely share that with our participants.
Sure. Yeah. Great. Thanks. So another question sort of related to your study participants. So what sort of education do firefighters receive on this topic? I think related to cancer. Is this something that is taught when firefighters attend their usual trainings? If it's not the norm, is there a group working on this aspect of outreach? Thank you.
Yes, fortunately, there's some firefighters that are very passionate about this. So I would say many decades ago, there wasn't really anything about it in their training. Now it's very common to at least the academy is like a few weeks long, but to be at least an hour-long session. Sometimes more than that. Sometimes there's a whole day on like health and safety and things like that. But they're learning so much. It's like when you start any new job and you're learning everything about the job. So that presentation you had on cancer, you're probably going to forget about it next week. So there's a push to also have more reminders about this. A lot of the big departments that have the resources to do so have their own health and safety programs where they have some refreshers that include reminders about things like this and how to decrease your risk, that they give to all firefighters, over time, like kind of little refresh courses every couple of years. But not all departments do that. So there's definitely a push to have materials that any firefighter can access, even if their department doesn't have a lot of health and safety resources. There's some very good both science communicators and fire service leaders who are passionate about this that are kind of putting together these materials, but we just have to get them out to more and more departments.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. And then a question about a little bit of the science of the cohort. So within this cohort study, what consideration is given to potential confounding factors that could exacerbate cancer risk? So I'm thinking along the lines that firefighters have high stress jobs. I reckon that puts them more at risk for like smoking more, maybe drinking more. And if so, are there like other behavioral interventions that could help eliminate risk, like reducing stress, reducing potential drug use by focusing on some of these like secondary stress factors?
Definitely. And part of that is why part of our group has started focusing on mental health, because that is something you can use the health and safety team in a fire department to bring in counselors. There's some departments that have started these peer-to-peer mentoring programs, which help to reduce stress and anxiety and even kind of reveal when maybe somebody has PTSD and they might need help. So that's on that side of things. On the stress side, there's some research going into that, and we collect a lot of data on that in our survey too, kind of these
Hmm.
stress and mental health outcomes. We also do collect data on drinking and smoking patterns. Fortunately, most firefighters are not smoking, or at least they're kind of not allowed most fire departments. So you might also just say no, even if it's yes.
Hmm.
But I think especially because of what they see happen in their job, most firefighters are not smoking, but you see some drinking, like some binge
Hmm.
drinking, especially on off days and things like that when you're not at the station. So, yeah, I know some people in the field who have had campaigns more targeted at drinking too, like more healthy drinking and not having that be another
Another
exposure
layer.
on top of
Yeah.
everything else that you're adding. And also sleep. We collect information on sleep and adjust for that too. And some of our partners have also tried to there are ways to try to improve sleep in the station. For instance, have not every like if there's two teams of firefighters there for the night, just give the alarm to one of them, so not everybody has to wake up. For instance, if only four people
Mm.
are going to go, and then also just encouraging good sleep outside of work too, when
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. That's great. Great advice. Um, so like next question is about the firefighter equipment. So is there an effort to advance the development of better equipment for firefighters who are fighting these prolonged fire emergencies? And then is this a priority since like incidences, I think cancer incidences are occurring more often, or maybe like these prolonged fire emergencies are happening more often, or maybe both?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, there are definitely people working on better gear that can be used in the prolonged incidents, the high risk incidents, and
Hmm.
just for general like wild. Oftentimes, the wildland firefighters are a special group that's what they do. Like that's kind of like their whole job for a half year every year. So for that group too, there's been pushes to develop better gear. It's been challenging because again they can't wear the heavy masks and things like that, but
Right.
people are developing lighter masks and trying to figure out, okay, what does it really help? Is it blocking anything worthwhile or not, kind of thing? Because the lighter ones don't block everything, but they can block some particulates and things like that. So there's definitely things like that in development, and different groups testing them, and then you also have different groups trying to push these. If something
Hmm.
works, you also have to convince like firefighters, not really up to them if they're get a new set of gear or not. Their department needs to buy it for them, and the city needs to approve that in the budget and
Right.
things like that. So there's a lot of that work going on as well.
Right. Thanks. And then since you've been working, primarily in this domestic U.S. context, another question was, would you recommend to repeat this study in middle and low income countries to assess, relative risk for firefighters in those communities?
Certainly. Yeah, I was a couple of years ago, I got to be part of this World Fire Congress, which was amazing. And it was put on by our US Fire Administrator at the time, Dr. Lori Moore Merrill. And she brought together fire service representatives from 50 countries. And it was really neat and great to just have everyone was really concerned about the same issues. But yeah,
Hmm.
obviously in certain countries, people don't have the same resources. In some countries, they don't even have very many firefighters total. And the ones that they do have some outdated equipment and gear and things like that. So their jobs are much more challenging and sometimes dangerous. So I think, there's been efforts for a lot of these countries, kind of fire service leaders, to work together since then. And right now they're kind of at this knowledge sharing thing, like time point, where they say, okay, like if you can, here's like the best cheaper gear that you can get, here's a good
Mm-hmm.
like SOP for this or that, kind of sharing these practices across countries. But yeah, I agree that it would be good to look at health risks specifically in places where the exposures are different, the PPE is different.
Hmm. And then, so like thinking about like disease prevention. So I guess does disease prevention look different for firefighters? And then is there legislation in place to protect firefighters from cancer risk, or is this like a gap that needs to be addressed still?
Yeah, so prevention, um, Prevention, of course, is different for firefighters because
Hmm.
I think they should still follow best practices kind of outside of work that we give
Right.
to any person in the U.S. For instance, here, have clean water, have good diet, things like that. But then at work, there's extra prevention measures. These cleaning off as much as you can after fires, having the best gear possible, all of these factors that we know can protect them at work. So that's definitely some very work specific practices. Then legislation wise, there has been a legislation for firefighters, and in part due to research and advocacy,
Hmm.
has been updated. I think quite a few times in the last few decades. Things have changed, like reducing the use of PFAS in a lot of products
Yeah.
that firefighters use, especially the foams. Like there's been a lot of legislation about that, especially kind of like state by state level. Um, Also, state by state, different states have cancers that they'll consider kind of from the job. So if a firefighter does get
Hmm.
cancer, they can get workers' comp and things like that, but that does vary by state. And then there are there's other types of legislation about what kind of minimum gear has to be provided and things like that too.
Mm. No, that's helpful. Thanks, Jackie. Um, and then I think last question, thinking about these like different interventions that y'all are testing as part of your group. Oh wait, one more question after this one. Sorry. So what are the main findings of these potential beneficial interventions? Has one method proved better than the others? And then are there any definitive results that others outside of your study could use in their daily life, like a dietary intervention, for instance, for cancer reduction?
Sure. Yeah, so the plasma donation we know from our work, but from there was a group in Australia that did that too. Plasma donation does reduce PFAS levels in your body.
Yeah.
So, and PFAS isn't the main, like the only exposure firefighters have. But if you're a firefighter with elevated PFAS levels, donating plasma something like 6 times in a year, if that's something you can do health wise, could does reduce your PFAS levels in your body a lot. So that's something that's helpful just for that particular exposure. The exercise and dietary and supplement ones we're actually kind of still in the middle of right now. So, a couple things look promising there, some of our health biomarkers, but all that's not quite finished yet. But I have seen, from other, for like the general population, there has been a lot of excitement about things like broccoli type products and how that can have protective effects. I think there's been some evidence out there that can be helpful for anybody. Other like antioxidant type rich diets, that's a lot of fruits and colorful fruits and vegetables and things like that seem to be protective against cancer for any sort of person too, things like that.
Yeah. Great advice. Um, and then one more question coming in from Carl. I'm a fire chief, 25 years in the U.S. Air Force Aircraft Structural and Wildland Fire Service. I'm also in the EMBA program at University of Michigan. Super interested in getting involved in this study. However, I can help. What's the best way to help out?
Oh, that's a great question. So here, well, if you want, why don't you just email me and we'll chat. We'll chat and I'll see. We'll think of some things.
And then one other question came in, I think, related to as you were talking through um, blood donation, plasma donation being a good way to get PFAS out of our bodies. A question is PFAS eliminated via menstruation?
Yes. So women, among our firefighters, but among any women that you can study anywhere, will have lower levels than men, like for that exact reason.
Hmm. Thanks. These are all really great questions. I super
Mm-hmm.
appreciate everybody putting them in the chat. We've just look for if there's any lingering questions. Really appreciate everybody. Dr. Goodrich, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your advocacy and your outstanding science in this area. Um, doesn't look like we have any other chat questions coming in, but as you can see in the chat, if you do have additional questions for Dr. Goodrich and want to communicate about being able to get involved, her email is there. Otherwise, thank you so much, Dr. Goodrich. I'm going to round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will see you at the next My Cares webinar. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a nice afternoon.
Yes, thank you.